Yeah.
Police, was ist noch?
Ja, weiß nicht, in welche Woche es ist, aber kurz davor.
Okay, so.
Ja, deswegen kannst du nicht kommen.
Ja, klar.
All right. The time is 5 minutes past. We're okay. Mostly it's global econ here, I'm seeing.
Oh, it's the same rule, so we just swing there, shell it back here.
Okay. For those of you who are confused, this session is on the economics and trade modeling in a changing food system. If you don't want to be here, you're free to leave. But important section about. The first order of business is that we need a rapporteur for this meeting. Are there any volunteers or
The notes, so
taking notes and perhaps giving feedback to a plenary session later today or tomorrow? The main outcomes.
I'm happy to do it.
Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah, sure. I don't know you.
I'm Nat Springer. I'm in the University of Minnesota.
Okay, pleased to meet you.
If you prefer for
I think it's okay. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, fine.
Guys on
the people that are
Worked yesterday here, right?
Yeah, it did work. Yeah, with the microphone.
We'll see. Online. That's the other question. I see. We have one person online. Yeah.
Is it us?
It's someone from here. My Gosia. The only person online right now. Okay. So we have our rapporteur. So let me get started. I was asked to provide kind of a introduction to what this session is about, so I'll do that. It's kind of a smorgasbord of all of possible trade issues. All right, so let's get started. So just a laundry list of potential topics that we've already been working on or we could potentially work on. So and I'm focusing mostly on trade. Well, obviously, there are feedback onto the general economy. But so for developing countries, I think that the big story kind of post-COVID is the whole issue of reshoring, resiliency, having diversified sources of a bunch of products, national security, new technologies. And here, I'm already thinking about like electric vehicles, batteries, any kind of equipment that's needed for the green transition, and including natural resources, things like lithium, cobalt, and other natural resources that are required for the transition. And the natural resource is complicated because there are kind of two phases there. There's the mining phase, and we know where many of the natural resources are, and then there's the refining phase. And at the moment, much of the refining is quite concentrated. But you would think that that would be an area where diversification would be possible. I think for many developing countries, moving up the value chain is still really kind of the key priority. I mean, there are other priorities, obviously, but I think for many developing economies, really, how do we become the next Korea, the next China? And there again, there have been many developments, partly driven by the first Trump administration that put in high tariffs on Chinese exports, gave opportunities for a country like Vietnam, Bangladesh, Mexico to some extent to fill in that void. So there have been opportunities there, and many developing countries are still driven by the natural resource cycles, both for ag and mineral resources. The third, I think, big theme really has to do with macroeconomic management. And you think this is a problem largely for developing countries, but even for many developed countries, this is a big issue. This is apparently one of the issues motivating President Trump right now. It's just a very large imbalances that the U.S. is running. I don't think he fundamentally understands where those imbalances are coming from. He thinks he could solve them with trade policy. I think he's a bit mistaken about that, but we'll see. But for many countries, and then volatile terms of trade and exchange rates. That's, I'd say, largely more of a developing country issue. And if you want to focus specifically on food and agriculture, self-sufficiency is a stated objective of many countries, and many countries act on that. I think I saw last week that India just relaxed its trade policy on rice exports, I think. Again, that was presumably to remain self-sufficient. And I worked at the FAO back about a decade ago, actually, when I started working with AgMIP. And when you look at their long-term forecast, it was really driven by self-sufficiency in trade. So I always thought that Europe, for example, would become a major agricultural exporter because with increasing productivity, declining population, and stagnant food demand, you would think that over the longer term, Europe would become a fairly significant food exporter. But in the FAO mind frame, no, the production would just go down, and that its food self-sufficiency would remain more or less stable across all economies. So that was one of the driving factors in their projection, and something that we need to think about as well when we do our baselines. I think market and policy volatility is obviously a very important one. We saw that in the food crisis in 2007, 2008. And in terms of policy volatility, we're witnessing that right now with many countries retaliating against U.S. trade policies, for example, by targeting key agricultural commodities. A more technical issue are the SPS and TBT, so that's phyto and phytosanitary and technical barriers to trade for many developing countries. This is a much more important barrier to exporting than tariffs, and it's something that we don't really pay much attention to. But in the greater scheme of things, it's actually very, very important for countries that would like to export. A rising issue with the embodied emissions in trade. So this is kind of a eat local movement. For example, in the UK, they should stop buying green beans from Kenya because of the emissions embodied in transporting the green beans to the UK. It turns out that growing green beans in the UK is actually quite emissions intensive. So you have to do your life cycle analysis quite well. And then the food stocks, I mean, that's kind of linked to the volatility issue. That's kind of a more short and medium term issue than a long term. Then one of the other longer term issues are things like shifts in food preferences. If you go along with the kind of traditional paradigm, you'd expect to see meat consumption to go up pretty rapidly over the next 3 decades. You're getting 2 billion extra people in Africa and in South Asia between now and 2050. With incomes rising, you would expect to see large changes in meat consumption. That would be kind of the traditional view, but we just finished the report for AgMIP10 about moving in the opposite direction, right? So eating less and eating less meat in particular. And then we're doing a lot of work in food loss and waste along the entire value chain. Then the last 2 bullet points relate to climate change and its impact. So clearly, climate change is going to have huge impacts on yields, both in crops and livestock, which is going to change the relative competitiveness across regions, which would induce, in principle, increases in trade. And then there's the whole story about mitigation policies. That also will change competitiveness. It increases energy costs. Then the more recent policies looking at things like the carbon border adjustment measures. So that would be, so if Europe imposes high cost on carbon, that's going to increase costs for the European producers. And so imports will come in more freely. So one way to deal with that would be to tax the carbon content of imports. That's what the CBAM relates to. There are also opportunities on bio-based fuels, as controversial as that might be. There are some potential opportunities there. I think 2 of the big policy issues is whether agricultural emissions will be part of any kind of mitigation policies. I think there is a lot of uncertainty about that. And then as well, land use changes, and to what extent afforestation, deforestation, reforestation will be part and parcel of any kind of mitigation policy. You guys will have an opportunity to add to this list, but I think it's pretty comprehensive. In terms of what the Global Econ Group has done so far, or recently, so the big one is the Lancet study on sustainable diet. As I said, eat less and eat better. And so we've been looking a lot at the economic and trade impacts, as well as, of course, the impacts on key environmental indicators such as land use and emissions. Maxim, along with some colleagues, is doing a lot of work right now on food loss and waste, as I say, along the entire value chain. So there are 2 components of that: the value chain, as well as improving private behavior, using taxes, for example, or other incentives. And then another project we're working on, which is not AgMIP, it's kind of in the AgMIP umbrella, but not an AgMIP project right now, is circularity in agriculture. Maxim and I, along with Daniel, we're doing a lot of work in livestock, and with lighting as well, on livestock, circularity in livestock. So what is our remit? So we have to identify existing AgMIP and related activities in this area. I've identified 3, but I don't know everyone here in this room. So, and even for those I do know, there might be things that they want to add. I know PIC is doing a lot of work on planetary boundaries, for example. What are the most recent advances? So that's kind of step 1. And then in step 2, is where will we go next? So we started this discussion yesterday. Yesterday's morning side event, but it's a bigger group right now, so we can focus on this. So why don't we start with opening up to the audience right now on other related activities. I haven't mentioned the work that Roberto is doing, so it's connected to the global econ area, but it's kind of a different focus. So Roberto, please feel free to chime in as well with the work that you're doing. So who wants to get started? What's missing from the list of activities that I presented? Wagoning? Dan?
Well, I don't know if I need to talk to the microphone, if there's anyone actually online, but one activity or related activities that might be of interest to this community would be there's quite a bit of work around sort of optimization models. And when they're doing these sort of food system optimization, they often show that if you produce things in the most environmentally efficient place, you can have massive reductions in environmental consequences, which implies really basically completely free trade in very radical ways. But I think there could be some really interesting opportunities for engagement with types of groups that do some of those types of models and sort of contrasting them with economic models that have a bit more constraints on how you can or can't do sort of open up markets to trade. And I just thought that it might be something worth exploring as well, because some of the stuff that like kind of Unsantins does, her model at Wageningen, it's an optimization model, and if she doesn't carefully constrain it, it can give you really very optimistic scenarios of what you could do with trade. But there are plenty of other models that do sort of optimization that come to the same kind of conclusion, and it might be an interesting opportunity to do comparison across types of models. So,
These are global models?
yeah, some of them are global, some of them are regional, but there's definitely some of these sort of like global land use models that they'll reallocate production to the most environmentally efficient. And then if you look at how much they reallocate, it'd be a massive change to the trade system. So there could be some interesting opportunities there.
So Hannah is the other person.
And there's some others, but just to sort of put that on the potential areas that might be for cross pollination.
You're getting all of this?
Doing my best.
All right, good.
I have one short one because we're working with
Matt Springer, by the way, at the University of Minnesota. Maybe. Can you all hear me? Okay. Oh, I'm sorry for the audience people. Thank you. I mean, in that same vein, I think we're working with a regional model in the US. And we're trying to expand back out to the global phase. So I don't know how much this group has done on comparing regional models with global models, particularly if they're looking at similar things, similar scenarios. But that's something I'm just interested in learning about who's doing what, and where, as we're bringing econ into kind of our approach a little bit more, what we can learn from other folks here.
On that, there have been several things that have been going on. So at the center, the GTAT Center, along with the University of Wisconsin-Madison and USDA, we're building a version of the GTAT database that incorporates all 50 US states.
Okay.
And so we can look at, sub-regional agriculture production and, for example, assess the impact of tariffs on across states and things like that. The Brazilians have done something similar. That's right, you've been doing that. The Chinese have a sub-regional model of China that they're embedding in GTAT as well. And I believe the Canadians as well. So there is some stuff there, but then there's much more smaller scope models, really focused at modeling at district or county level. I don't know if Bert would say something about that.
Yeah, we are also in AgMIP. One distinction when we go in agri, you may hear regional economics and global economics. So when we say regional, is mostly subnational landscape or just subnational level. So one of the activities we are doing in AgMIP is trying to link the models across the scales. So we have this initiative called INARA, Integrated National to Regional Assessments. Although global is not in the word, but in the name, but it's part of the structure, coming from the global outputs to national models to subnational models. So that's one of the components that we are doing. In the US, we've been approached last year by ERS. They are revamping the RIP model. So they want to link that with our trade-off analysis model that we have in AgMIP. So that's one thing that I don't know what the status is now, how things are, but that was one potential activity. The other thing I wanted to mention that is not for now, but thinking in the future, there is a new global activity that is aimed to develop global adaptation pathways. It's kind of a spin-off of the SSP's development, the shared socioeconomic pathways, but now they want to match those SSPs to adaptation pathways. And they're doing this for all the sectors, for health, for all the sectors of the economy. And at least for now, I'm leading the agriculture and food systems.
They're gonna affect, probably they're gonna push up prices in certain regions. I don't know how much will go to agriculture, but some of it will go to agriculture. And could be an interesting link to look at how this can affect climate change mitigation and adaptation.
Okay, that's also the second part. What we do next, it's just, yeah. That's all right. It's always great to have ideas.
Yeah, thanks, Herman from the Global Economics team. I see 2 parts here. One is more ideas what we could do in the global econ team, and we started that discussion yesterday, and I have the feeling we already have a long list of good ideas, and you added several more, Dominic. So we will not be short of good ideas, and we need to prioritize anyway. I think, and we should mention also in report back some of those. But in the AgMIP context, it's maybe a bit more challenging the question, what are new interactions with other groups in AgMIP? I mean, the classical one was with the global crop modelers, and I think we have explored that a lot. Yesterday, we talked about this whole thing about extremes and how do we deal with that. I think that's still an open question. But beyond the global crop model group, I don't think we have so many obvious connections. I mean, the one with Roberto, but we tried for quite a while, and I think we never really found a connection. So as Roberto said, I think we probably need from the global this national layer in between. I mean, some models which can address for certain countries, what are national scenarios more or less in line with the global scenarios, which then can be used by the subnational region models to say, okay, what does this mean? And I think we never got there. So maybe it's something to explore from your perspective. But I think yesterday we also discussed some of the global models have case studies for specific countries, right? And maybe we should start some kind of inventory or so. I mean, Marcus gave some examples. Several of the global models have had projects in specific countries where they applied that model. And maybe this would also be a pragmatic way to say, look, we're taking some of the scenarios we have done now for e-glances, whatever, which are already there. How do they play out in country X, Y, Z? And can that be connected then to what Roberto and the regional teams are doing? I mean, one example from our team, from PIC, we have a team in India now, so we did some deep dives for India with similar scenarios. So theoretically, this could be connected to some of the regional teams in India. I mean, this is easy to say, not so easy to set it up, but this would for me be an explicit example to connect to a large team within AgMIP. But then I have a few other points which I think are really important to us, where I don't see directly other teams in AgMIP working on it. So Claudia Ringer mentioned water, right? We always talked about the water issue, which is affecting many things. Biodiversity is increasingly coming up. I mean, we are connected to University of Minnesota, Justin Johnson, and the Invest guys. There's so much to do and so many questions, but I don't think other teams in AgMIP are doing it. But this is something we could also address. And a bit of a wider focus, but Dominic already mentioned it. More integrative, like we are working on planetary boundaries, also in the e-Lancet context. We could also frame that in the SDG context. I mean, very soon the discussion will start about SDGs beyond 2030. And I think we should be, let's see, maybe it's not the...
Well, at least they're no longer called the Millennium Development Goals.
Let's see. I mean, I expect something will come up there, and we should also be prepared for that. But that's again something within the global econ team. I would be happy for other ideas which we could report where we connect to the other teams in AgMIP. Sorry for the long, but good. So sorry. So one other thing I wanted to mention, which also mentioned in the morning, bioeconomy. I mean, that's partly covered maybe by your points, Dominic, but this whole issue about, things which are drawn in the field to be used for different purposes in the future. This also links to the general economy. I'm missing that a bit. Or maybe we could also talk to the crop modelers. Is this relevant for them? I mean, some of the standard crops can also be used for industrial purposes, for whatever, building materials. What do they have anything to say about that? I think that's it's a broad topic, but I think some of the teams have certainly already worked on that. And I think this will also become more relevant for our scenarios.
Just a follow-up on what I said about INARA. The first pilot study that we did was with Daniel a couple of years ago, almost 3-4 years ago. We used impact as the global model, impact SIM as a national model, and we linked that to our trade-off analysis. That was a case for Senegal, right, Daniel? It was very loose, but we faced some challenges in terms of matching across the scales, but that was the first try. Now we are working with REAPA, the increment models, and the idea is to link impact REAPA and the TOA MD model. But one thing that we realize is that we have the global economics team, we have the regional economics team, subnational, but I think we need to strengthen the national level. So maybe create a group that focuses on national modeling. I know that several of the global models can do national as well, right? But I think we need to work more on that level and how, because I think that's the interface linking with the global and the subnational. And John Antle and I, for many years, were saying we need a national model, and that's where we're trying to do now. So that's what I would propose. See, we can create this specific national level modeling, if that's makes sense. Or
It's a good question. There is, at the IAMC, the Integrated Assessment Modeling Consortium, there is a new group, relatively new group, that is looking at national modeling. I think Shinichiro Fujimori is head of that group, and there'll be other people involved in it as well. So, but they're not focused on ag necessarily. Yeah.
But just to understand, Roberto, I mean, we've talked about RIAPA for quite a while. My understanding is they do have models for many different countries, right? Aren't they already available? I mean, as you're saying, are those national models already available?
right, like RIAPA, but we want more models, right? So RIAPA has been applied, maybe we can know whether they have been applied. Yes, RIAPA has been applied to several countries already, right? But it's just one model. So we want to have more models and see we can have this modeling comparison at the national level that can be also useful for this cross-scale integration.
We have on Thursday a radical collaboration session, I would be calling it, where we will talk about crop growth models, knowns and unknowns, and also economic models, and what is missing from the one to the other. And the important thing for this session to understand that all the economic models that we use in the that we handle in the Global group have trade inherent in them. An economic model trade is the balancing equation. So all the climate change impacts, all the work you do on reducing food waste, or the work you do or plugging trade restrictions, goes through the whole treadmill. So that means that all the global supply and demand system has to balance. So when you put a restriction in one side, then it will be adjusted by changes in another one. We did this peseta study, and we hope to maybe do a peseta 5. It will be called differently probably in the commission in the next years, in which we were clearly identifying what are the biophysical impacts of climate change and what are the economic impacts of climate change, and they are radically different. Because when you have in Southern Europe a very strong signal of climate change, this doesn't mean that that area will have lower food. This is just the food will come from the north. So all these adjustments take place.
Those comments are like popping up.
In the chat?
Yeah.
Oh, now I gotta figure out where the chat is. If the person online wants to talk, the mic is open. I don't see the chat.
Claudia, that was your comment on the RIAPA maybe not being updated for because of budget cuts. Yeah.
Sorry. Yes. I had no more power, so I went to the room. So there are 35 countries with national level CGE models, but several of these have been supported by US aid, and so now I think a bunch of them will be dropped. I mean, will simply not be updated. And so there will be, obviously some realignment in countries for which there still is some funding. Yeah, so just wanted to mention that when the whole RIAPA question came up.
Thanks, Claudia. Yeah, good point. There's a lot of uncertainty across the board at this thing.
And Dominic, could I wanted to follow up on Roberto's issue about the national modeling. Roberto, from your perspective, is it more useful? Because I know RIAPA has a lot of socioeconomic disaggregation. They tend to have like, 5 to 10 income groups. But for your purposes, the spatial disaggregation is probably more useful, right? I mean, and I know some of the global to local stuff that you're doing and Ron is doing is getting down to county level for the US. Would you consider that type of disaggregation to be more useful? I guess you'd want to have both, but in terms of if you had to choose between one, it's more the spatial disaggregation, right? Which some of the global models don't always have for the countries, parts of the models that they're there.
Right. Yeah, and the reason that we chose REAP before we use impact sim, and yeah, I agree. I mean, we would like to have more spatial disaggregation, but REAP seemed to be a good option for several reasons, and because of all the sectors involved and all the work that James Turler has been doing also with climate change. But yes, we would like to see other models as well here in the US and in other regions.
My guess, I haven't polled the global economists that could do that after this meeting, but the way we normally operate is that we'll take the largest economies, so we'll have the US, China, typically the European Union as one unit, not separated out, and then we might pull out some of the largest economies from each of the continents. So we'll probably have Brazil, maybe Indonesia, in Asia, in Africa, some people will pull out South Africa and perhaps Nigeria, and India, of course, in South Asia. So there might be kind of a representative sample from all the global economics team of the largest economies, but I think there are very few that are modeling smaller countries that even not large. I mean, Ethiopia would be one point. So if we want to go in this direction, it probably is going to require some thought amongst the modelers to see, if we can establish kind of a harmonized set of countries that we would like to focus on. All right. Just on identifying other AgMIP, I haven't heard from the magnet group. You want to add anything, Marco?
Yeah, I can.
You don't have to.
Yeah, no, but I have a couple of things that I heard, and I'm still getting familiar with how this session plays out. But there's a couple of things we are doing when I hear about trade. So right now we are working on having some sort of negative or pessimistic baselines on trade to incorporate all the role of all these trade wars that are going on. So the reactions of the EU to what the US is doing, Mexico, Canada. And yeah, I'm wondering if there is an idea there to try to consolidate the approach on how we deal with these sort of new dynamics that are happening so that we can align the way we approach them in a way. So right now, I think it's a more isolated effort, like more local to a European project that we are doing right now. But I'm wondering if there's an idea there or possibilities to try to, align the approaches on this direction. And I want to second what Herman said on the part of the biodiversity. Right now, I mentioned that yesterday, we're doing a lot of links of economy and nature. So there are a lot of things, so interest even in the private sector. There's this project right now working with Deloitte on the links within the financial sector and biodiversity and all these connections of nature and the economy. I think that's a topic that it can be like a new, new topic to focus on. I think it's coming up a bit stronger at the minute. And yeah, I like a lot the idea of trying to link our bigger platforms or efforts on the part of that we've been doing, for instance, on the 8 Lancet, on try to see what is being developed there and implications on deep dives on countries. So right now I'm working with Daniel on a project with Mexico and the impact of climate change to food security, and there are some ideas there to incorporate some trade aspects on these trade wars with the US. So there are some efforts there going on that have been asked to link up with these bigger efforts we are doing.
All right. The center folks.
Yeah, so it seems to me that for example, water and biodiversity, some of these are related to there's an initiative in which the GTAP Center is part of. It's called GlassNet. So basically, what it's trying to do is to link global to local to global analysis. And I think I'm not saying that we should go there at this time, but there's a lot of benefits to doing that. And since most of the models that are here have grid cell level capabilities, then it is possible to focus on the water and biodiversity based on those grid cell level. Just a plug on the GTAP side, we have been working on linking, apart from the regional US version that Dominique mentioned earlier in collaboration with University of Wisconsin. We also have a current project where we link the GTAP model with the simple G model so that we can go into the grid cell. So we have a global CGE with a grid cell level representation, and currently we are working on the US and Brazil, and eventually expand from there. Thanks.
Yeah, well, I guess I have two follow-ups, one on what Marco was saying or what you were just saying. One might just be to sort of back up Claudia's comment earlier, where I think if water is going to be a really important aspect of what we want to do, then we probably need to start engaging more with water modeling, because at the grid cell, is it really sufficient if you're looking also at irrigation infrastructure and how investments in that can then lead to changes in sort of where water is available for irrigation and things like that. So there might be something that to prioritize in terms of trying to find ways to link into those types of groups. I don't know if Marcos, if you were thinking of this, but to me, one of the things I think would be really interesting with the trade is having something a little bit similar like what we talked about, I don't know how many years ago it was, with those representative agricultural pathways, but having something for trade. When we've done the open trade in the few global econ scenarios that we've done that in a very sort of hatchet job kind of way, where we just sort of, some models just, cut the tariffs in half or something like that, and some can do a little bit better, but we don't really go into a more nuanced idea of what does a retrenched world look like. And it would be kind of interesting to think about, how do we represent a world where in fact we are re-entrenching? It's not just going to be affecting trade and goods, it's also going to have effects on TFP growth. We're going to have less spillover effects because we won't have as much knowledge generation happening. That will slow down. There won't be as much exchange of ideas. There might be issues on migration. And so I think, maybe taking that idea of what does a world that is sort of doing these like trade wars, what does that look like beyond just mechanically the amount of goods that are moving around, I think would be a really interesting exercise to run in the global economic scenarios. Interesting if that was something we could you're writing it up there. We could link that to like an SSP4 or SSP3 narratives, which sort of talk about fragmentation, but then don't provide a whole lot of detail of exactly what that looks like. But I think that would be really interesting if we did that. I think Armand, you were.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel and Marcus. I had a similar thought when Marcus said that. Maybe it could be our task as a group to. I wouldn't like to go back to the representative agricultural pathways, because there was always this confusion, how do they connect to the SSPs? And I think when we have the SSPs and they are very rich and it's a good reference, but why don't we engage exactly in the lines what Daniel said, developing, let's call it SSP3 plus or something, because I mean, several people have argued that maybe the, instead of SSP2, we are basically probably rather on an SSP3 path.
I think we're on the SSP4 first.
Yeah, okay, so maybe both. Why don't we, with all our knowledge, and this could be an excellent joint paper, going back to the original storylines, which already have elements of less trade, slower development, and so on, I mean, I was involved in creating the whole things from the very beginning, together with Kata and Aka and guys. So why don't we go back to those two storylines, SCP 3 and 4, and enrich them with all the details we know now and we would like to have in terms of more details on trade, on agricultural productivity or whatever. I think that could be a very fruitful exercise and very helpful for us, for, having these alternative baselines, but also for anyone else using this. This is a very interesting idea, I think.
That's what you want, so, by the way, we've moved officially into the second part of this, so we're talking about what we're gonna do next, all right?
I've been kind of pasting them into the groups because there's been a lot of what we do next, and I think kind of captured it.
Just wanted to mention, regarding to what you mentioned on the linkages between the economic level and the grid level, that within the Lamasus project at IASA, I mean, one of the things that happens is a lot of economic models try to go to the grid, but everybody does it differently. And everybody uses a different database, so what we tried in this project is to have a common approach. This is called downscale R or something. It's used at IASA, where we get all the data, all the geographical data and management data, farm level and so on. And then what we do is just provide the economic results from all the models, from different models, and then they, within a common approach, break it to the grid. But one method for all the economic models that are involved in the analysis is something that we could maybe think about in our next phase. And we go to the second phase. Sorry.
More. Again, this is more for the future. Over the last couple of years, I've been involved with a committee of the U.S. National Academies of Science for a U.S. Congress mandate and a report on the potential impacts of a nuclear war on the environment and agriculture. It's part of that. The report was supposed to be launched a month ago, but the current administration asked us to review some keywords. We could not say climate, we could not say female, we could not say impacts, and
Try to say nuclear war.
we could say nuclear war. Not female, yes. But in the recommendations, the conclusion recommendations, AgMIP is named explicitly for the need to invest on modeling in the comparisons that can deal with shocks, right, like a nuclear war. I know there has been already some papers and publications, but they would like to invest, well, at least the previous administration, I don't know what's going to happen, but the idea was to use this report to ask for funds for modeling improvement, and not just in global economics, but also in other type of models like fires and other things related to a nuclear war. So hopefully this report is going to be launched, expected in May, if they approve all our revisions. And we'll see. We're trying to make the case for funding. And as I said, AgMIP global economics is named explicitly in the report. So we'll see.
Very quickly is indirectly linked to AgMIP because of the GlassNet team, but it's a kind of a response to Claudia's provocation. John is in the final revision of a paper that we are actually linking a global dimension with the climate model and then with the land use irrigation model. So basically what we are testing at the grid cell level in Brazil, what would be the impact of two climate change scenarios. And this is going to be linked with what might happen in terms of crop yields of land use change. For example, a mild land use impact will prompt irrigated cropland. But if it happens to be very severe, there's no water for irrigation, and then it will boost rainfed. Regarding Daniel's comment on this exchange of ideas, we have a very nice model from Keith Fugly it treats R&D as a stock of knowledge, technology as a stock. And then there is a component that simulates this exchange, this technology transfer part. This will be very interesting in this moment to test, for example, some of the impacts we might have. And we have, again, working under Tom's leadership in the GlassNet, we have this linked to the simple model. And what we can do, I think that goes more in the direction of improving the communication from the modeling results to the decision makers, to the policy makers. One of the things we are doing in a project, for example, we have some municipalities, they are receiving a lot of digital solutions, digital transformations. But if we want to connect this municipality into a global model, it's very difficult because of the scales we are talking about. So a first approach is just to use input-output matrices, and then we can communicate what would be the impact with politicians, with decision makers. Might be an opportunity as well to communicate better what might be the impacts.
Just I don't know where it is.
Gerard, he's with Embrapa in Brazil.
Just a few points. So water was mentioned several times. So we did a couple of years ago a project also within the GlassNet, where we did water balance model WBM developed by University of New Hampshire that simulates kind of all water flows like underground, very deep, to gridded model, simple G, to CG model envisage, and to AgRI, this agroeconomic model, looking into nitrogen cascade kind of how climate policies might impact their transfer of nitrogen to the Gulf of Mexico and creation of hypoxia zones. So that's like this local, global, local linkages with multiple models and featuring pretty extensively their water part. So there is this framework developed, and potentially it can be used for a variety of other applications. So one aspect that has not been a bit surprisingly to be mentioned much so far are distributional impacts assessment, right? So that's something we have been discussing, through the Lancet and a number of other projects. So both, regional, national, global. So that has been, I think this aspect has been featured a bit more in energy climate related literature. So distribution impacts of climate change, and we did some work there linking global TG models like GTAF and envisage to global income distribution dynamic model developed by World Bank colleagues with like more than 10 million households. And then, looking into different types of poverty and distribution implications, but obviously, with trade-related policies and ag and food-related policies, I think it becomes even more important to incorporate these types of assessments in their dietary-related agenda. But then discussing a bit more like going forward, I think one gap, and it's an objective gap due to data limitations, but most assessment and policies we have been looking so far, we have not been properly kind of costing them and properly including policies that would really incentivize those policies. So for instance, looking into food loss and waste reductions, we often assume, okay, it just happens, tech improvement, what are the impacts? Okay, dietary transition, well, we change our preferences, we use that. So it's like cost-free, and then the question is, can we really look properly into distribution implications of these moves without costing them? So what are the investments needed to achieve food loss and waste reductions? What are their, policy signals needed to achieve these dietary shifts? And so on and so forth. So I think, and there have been some knowledge building in that area, like, what are the investments needed to reduce food loss and waste at this specific stage for this crop. But so I think that's kind of next big area where hopefully, to make more progress, we can also better capture, the way forward.
Yeah, I think these are all really important issues. But I do want to remind us that we're a global economic group and that we're trying to do model comparison exercises. Some of these are going to be really difficult to do in that context. So I think about water, for example. Water is just a really difficult thing to do. There's a lot of progress that could be done. but I'm not sure that this is the right forum for that. But that's my view, but I'm willing to be convinced otherwise. So I think we really need to focus on the comparative advantage of this group. And we certainly have a lot of ideas for them.
Yeah, that's a good point, Dominic. I also want to actually, as I see your other points there on the slide, to other aspects, what would it take to make any of these activities happening? I mean, we have certainly even more ideas, all great ideas, I think. And what about the funding? I think we need to brainstorm a bit on that. I mean, this, as always, as we saw now with the E-Lancet study, as soon as we as a group have some core funding, you know, by Cornell together with this external funding from Lancet, and we have this kind of support unit, you see what we can do, right? It's amazing. But okay, and we also saw over the last years without that, okay, we were keeping going, but
we were on life support.
We were on life support. I mean, we had our more or less regular meetings, we kept the group going, and as soon as this opportunity came along, boom, I mean, 18 months or so, right, Daniel? And look at all this output, right? So I know there's no easy solution and it gets more difficult by the day, obviously, but let's spend a little bit of time also on brainstorming again what could be options. And as Dominic said, this is really about not individual groups getting funding, but some funding for at least, let's say, at least 3 or 4 of the groups getting together for some of these activities. I can only say from the European perspective, I mean, the EU Horizon program is still there. I mean, knock on wood that it will not be too much affected by whatever comes in terms of defense spending. There could be lots of indirect effects, but I would assume it will be still there, and there is some potential. But of course, in this group, we are also, okay, we have several groups from Europe, but not too many. I'm not sure. So that is an option which is in principle open, also not easy, but at least an opportunity for larger projects. But I don't know. Anyone's guess? What are other options out there to fund some of these activities?
Please introduce yourself. Yeah, sure.
My name is Shretu, so I'm from the UC Davis. I'm actually not in the AgMIP community, although I also work with the core model. And I'm actually wondering, like, so is there any like a product available or like project like being done like to actually to make the results or the fundings from AgMIP like more accessible to farmers? And I mean, like actually incorporating the core model from AgMIP with like the economic model or even value exchange model. But I feel like I think one of the goal of the core model is actually to benefit the farmers. And sometimes I think the driver of the farmers, they want to know like how much they can earn in next year or in the future. And which means that our results from the model should be monetized, should be translated maybe into the money, right? So I'm wondering like if there anything have been done or plan to be done.
Yeah, communication is a really important aspect of this. Most of our work has been in scientific publications. So our most famous article was in PNAS, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. We publish in a lot of different areas. I think the individual teams have probably done some outreach activities, locally. So I know at Purdue, we have maybe once a year or twice a year, we meet with the farmers groups in Indiana and talk about our results. But we haven't been there's no kind of organized program for outreach. Purdue now also actually has a podcast, and so that also is trying to reach out to the farmers. So but yeah, there's nothing organized. On this topic,
Yeah, just we have an AgMIP dashboard that has all the results from the AgMIP phases, the work that we did in Africa and Asia. It's an AgMIP Impact Explorer that is hosted by Wageningen University. So you can look at their own results. And there are a lot of publications also on the AgMIP website.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. So maybe also this in Europe we do have the NGOs, all the crop the cross NGOs organizing meetings, and we go and present results and they discuss with us, and the policy follows up and so on. On the funding, Herman, I have a draft text of what's coming up for the next 2 years for the 26-27 call. I think I cannot share it yet because it's still under discussion at the member state level. But I think we have at least 2 or 3 potential calls that we could go for on integrated modeling and so I think the role of economic models will increase a little bit in the sense that competitiveness is getting back to the front line in the Commission. So whether this will affect only European groups or not, that's something to discuss within the potentially. This can be bridged, like you do European and then some case studies outside and things like that. We've done this always. I mean, Dominic is himself in one of these European projects. And take on board and is that we don't price these things, but we model. So I think you said it. So quite a lot of the work that I'm doing now with the teams that I lead is on policy instruments to reach specific goals. Could be a climate target goal, or could be a health outcome, or could be a food loss, waste and loss reduction goal. And I'm sure you guys have done things like that. You realize how expensive is to get to a specific goal. Let's call it, for example, sugar consumption reduction. The tax you have to put on sugar to get to a healthy level is totally insane. It's just and I don't know. I think in this field there's a lot of work to do, and especially coming from CGEs, because a lot of the costs are in information campaigns, are in getting people, not just taxing the food that it's not only a price disincentive. It's a lot more than that. It's happening, but at least from the partial equilibrium model world, we cannot address that directly. But there is a lot of information and policies going on that actually do change behavior by consumers. Now, how much? That's the thing. How much can you put? For which cost are you ready to bear to achieve a certain health outcome, for example?
Oh, you can see the comments on great sugar labeling in Mexico visible on all the offers at AgMIP. All right, thanks, Claudia. Yeah, no, those are really the other thing on funding. So I think Europe is still pretty solid. The US for the moment is probably not. They're the foundations, but I don't see many of the foundations that are really interested in this type of work. I mean, if you think about the Gates Foundation, it's really project oriented. They really want, they kind of want, implement this policy, do the impact analysis, and see if it can be scaled up or something like that. They're not really interested in the kind of the big picture story that we're telling. Yeah, I'd say our main stakeholders are governments and international agencies, and they're the ones that are most interested in this work. So, but there are new foundations that have come up. Yeah, the Schmidt Foundation is a new one. We've submitted a proposal there recently, and I'm sure there'll probably be other ones that pop up as well.
Yeah, I was just going to say I wasn't here for the conversation yesterday when you were talking about circularity in ag, but I know the one foundation, PEPFAR, the Foundation for Future of Agricultural Research. They have interest in circularity. They're interested in foundations. You have to have a one-to-one match to get a grant from them, so you have to find other partners. But seems like that aligns with a group. They like to fund big partnerships and big groups. So that might be one. I know they've recently had a lot of interest in water as well. I know we talked about maybe that wasn't the best one to focus on, but that would be one foundation that comes to mind that seems to align. I was also going to mention in that circularity, I don't know if anybody has been involved in any of in the US, the ASABE, the American of Biological Engineers. They have a big circularity push. I know Jim Jones actually, who was part of this, is kind of pushing that as well. And in terms of partners, we're looking for similar funding in that space. That might be a group to talk to, because I know I went to a workshop with them last year, and they were looking for other groups working on this stuff. They were very much like, we're kind of doing this on our own. Who else is working on these things? So that might be a way to bring another group in to align on if you wanted to do like bioeconomy type stuff. You might find some willing partners and funding ideas there. Just a couple ideas.
I had been talking to him. Not recently. Is he still active?
It's the last time I saw him was at that workshop.
Okay.
Yep.
Erwin, you have money? Not just a quick one.
So, just linking it back to the plenary discussion earlier, one of the speakers mentioned land use. So I'm not sure if that has been addressed in the past, or if it's still a continuing gap in the global economic models.
We have, but it's never it's never not a story. Yeah, I mean, land use is critical. And again, I think on the land use, that probably goes back to more emphasis on the regional country analysis, just making sure that we understand what's happening, at that level rather than at the global level. The distribution there is really, really critical. John Maria, we haven't heard from you now.
Yeah.
Introduce yourself.
Yeah, this is Gianmaria Tassinari. I work at the Joint Research Center, the European Commission. And since this is the session of economic and trade from modeling perspective, I would like to raise the attention on the fact that I believe that we don't really capture well currently any model, the economic or food system. And I'm mainly referring to the competitive, the perfect competitive that we assume constantly. So I guess that we should also take into account this for the future at least to model better the economic food system. So take into account heterogeneity. There is no perfect information, varieties. As I was thinking for the hinterlands, that how important is varieties for the food, as well as oligopsony. So all these kind of things. I think we miss all of this, and I don't know any agricultural market that has a perfect competition. But we keep going with that. So I guess that should be at least raised as an issue beside water, biodiversity, land use.
All right. So we know ourselves. So Edmund, you mentioned working with other groups. Did you, beyond GGCMI, do you think there are others? And Roberto, of course. That's two, I think. That's a two, yeah. I mean, for the crop modelers, there's not that much interaction. Well, they may benefit from interacting with us. It's not clear what we would get from listening to the crop knowledge, yeah.
Yeah, there have been discussions by the crop modelers with Christoph and so on about feeding back results from the econ models back to them, like on land use patterns, for example. I'll present a paper tomorrow by our PhD student, by Edna. A big task, not easy, but we did something for AgMIP there. So the impact, the image team and the PIC team. So generating gridded land use patterns and feeding that back to them as an input. But it's first steps. If not, there's additional processing steps. But again, that's a connection with the GTCMI team, which we have already. Yeah, on the other teams, I don't know. Maybe it's an open question to plenary if we post some of the points we raised here. Who would be interested? I also don't have a clear overview. What are the activities there? There was a talk about livestock, but then again, the livestock modeling is on a completely different scale, actually. And the livestock sector is a big issue, but I think most of our models cover it to some extent. At least I don't see additional inputs from the other groups as they are working on different scales. So, yeah.
The other possibility would be going outside and then see if we wanted to go in this direction again on the more regional country analysis, working with NGLAPA, working with some ag modelers in China, India, Indonesia, Ethiopia. And so because there's where the knowledge is, right? Most of us don't have the knowledge of the specific countries, but working with local groups, I think would make a lot of sense in that specific area. We want to go down that direction.
But maybe a question to Roberto. I think this is really promising. Hard to do as we learned, but going into a number of countries and see how to improve that connection. Roberto, can you let us know again, what's the current status? From your perspective, in terms of in which countries or in which regions are those regional teams, actively running? Because in the early phase of AgMIP, there was this big funding from DFID, where these 8 teams were, I don't know, funded for what, 3-5 years across India, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and different parts of sub-Saharan Africa. But what's the current status in terms of their capacity, in terms of prioritizing? What are the, 5, 6, 7 countries where you would say, okay, here is an infrastructure to which could be, built upon?
So right now we have a small funding from the UK government, and we are focusing on Ghana and Senegal. But the idea is to extend that work to Ethiopia, Kenya, Nigeria, and Zimbabwe. That's going to come later. But in terms of teams that could, roll their sleeves and work, those 2 countries, Ghana, Senegal, and then India and Pakistan probably are the most active teams that we can try to do something.
Maybe one thing that is important to recall is that it's not only crops that we need, no. So it's we have this land use perspective, no. So we have a lot of the crops and activities. You mentioned livestock, no? In the future, over the next maybe mid to long term, the income increase in African nations and so on, and the high livestock content in diets in these countries. We don't have all that. So a lot of the linkages that we do need for some of these analyses are missing within the AgMIP consortium. Now there's one more. So I think you mentioned language, but it was going. So I think to kind of move a little bit towards a land use perspective would be very useful. We are more and more asked to do land use and land use change analysis. So because you don't measure anymore only methane and natural oxide, but you also measure carbon farming. Carbon farming is everywhere now. It's not just only in Europe. In order to be able to model and to account for the whole pool of carbon, you need to have forestry. So you need to have land use change analysis, and you need to know where the land. And in any of our models, the land goes somewhere. If you put a policy where you tax agricultural production, there will be less agricultural production. That land will go somewhere else. Something happens with that land. We are missing that entirely here. We have a commodity, a little bit old-fashioned, to be honest, commodity approach in agriculture. I think I'm not saying this has to happen now, but we have to think about moving forward with this. This affects the economics as well.
Maybe three questions. One, I do agree with this land use approach, because not only for all the things that have been discussed, but for example, sustainable aviation fuels, they are going to need that perspective so they can see what's going on. So indeed might have some funding in there. But also to look some of the spots we are not generally looking at. For example, if you consider the OECD data, the projections to 2040, beef consumption in developed countries are going to be reduced by less than 5%. So this livestock stuff is not only a developing country thing, it's a thing that is persistent even in developed countries. So we should put other look, we are always saying we're doing the same thing. So perhaps look a little bit different, might bring some new questions on that.
So on land use, yeah, I think land use is a good approach. Far side, I think taking all the money available on the sustainable aviation fuel angle, and he's got a pretty elaborate land use module. The only other model I know, kind of at the level we work at, would be GCAN, which models total land, including every land, managed land, everything. So I have some qualms about some of their approaches, but it would be doable in the CGE.
So this comes back to your point. This comes back to Dominic's point. I mean, is this something in this context to be done? I mean, this is something for the individual modeling groups to improve on their work. I mean, I think we are, with the big team, we are pretty complete on land use allocation and with forestry, and we ran scenarios about additional demand for wood, for building material and so on, and the pressure on the land. But I don't think this is something, for, as you pointed out, I mean, we also need to find the aspects which we can and want to cover in this multi-model setting without 5 years of model development first. I think that's unrealistic. I mean, it's important, but it's, I think, which is more interesting related from what Geraldo said, is this links back to the bioeconomy question, and that can be answered. This is more like a scenario, joint scenario setting. Okay, what's the effect of additional demand for building materials, or fuels, or different types of bioenergy, or what has been done in the IEM community, bioenergy combined with carbon capture and storage, or biomaterials, bioplastic or something. That can be done, right? We can translate those kind of demand projections and then saying, okay, what does this mean for the demand for agricultural raw products? And I think this is also a really important thing to do. First of all, to know what's the additional pressure imposed on the agricultural sector or the land sector, but also as a potential alternative to livestock production. I mean, we are talking so much about, the effects of livestock and reduced, and EAT have reduced consumption of livestock products. What are the alternatives? What are farmers going to do? Well, certainly to some extent, they will produce raw materials for these new purposes. And I think it would be very good to have those scenarios. And I think most of our models, with a bit of simplification, would be able to say something about that.
Joe, quick points. One is to link this, for example, with distributional aspects. I think this bring new insights, how different incomes are behaving in terms of these shocks that we could apply. And in terms of changing shocks from the demand side, changing the consumption pattern, for example, that I think that will depend on who pays the bill. For example, if you go to livestock farmers in Brazil, you go to OECD indicator, the transfer, what is the name, Kalik? The single commodity transfer, SCT for beef in Brazil. The guys are receiving 0.4% of the gross revenue at the farm gate level. So they are paying for everything. It's not just a matter of saying you need to do that unless there's legislation or regulation. Otherwise, you need to find some incentives. I'm not sure, but some of these incentives, are they well covered in terms of the countries? For example, if you go to Norway, the guys are receiving 60+% in terms of incentives. This is a different thing. So I'm not sure if they are really well covered in these modeling efforts.
All right, we're getting close to the end. I don't know if we have to conclude anything here. I think the low hanging fruit, to be honest, is this point here, doing SSP3, SSP4, and then more emphasis, drilling down on the result with control. This is, I think, important because of the current environment we're in. Right? And I wouldn't focus it necessarily on the current trade volatility, because it might be temporary. We'll see. But there are kind of longer term dynamics underlying what's going on today that we can exploit in looking at SSP3 and SSP4. So I think that would be easy. And that, this is kind of a non-brainer. We've been talking about it for at least 10 years that we should be doing that. And then, you could have some offshoots looking at distributional aspects. Not all the models will have that capacity, but some could. We could look at that. And some also have the capacity to look at SDGs more broadly. Biodiversity would fit into that, for example, and some of the teams would have that capability. But kind of focusing on the two broad issues and then having kind of subgroups, sub-themes working on some of the other ones. I think that would be one way to. That's my bias.
Very good. No. I just very good summary.
So one alternative setting would be to bring in, for instance, I don't know, global income, distribution model, and then we all AgMIP models run specific scenarios, and then we feed in inputs into that one model, which runs distributional assessment, and in this way also kind of captures uncertainty across models, but provides assessment within one model. Same, for instance, could be with, I don't know, water model. So bring in additional partner who has the capacity and will link all our models to that one model and have a range of results in that.
Yeah, the indicators we provide to the world bank's JID model are relatively limited. Food prices, energy prices, wages. So that all the models have that capability. So that would be one way of doing it. Just using one single distribution model, but pooling all the indicators from all the methods.
Israel is not there.
Huh?
Israel is not at the.
Apparently he's a free agent.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the other things that would be useful is if we could also start thinking about different ways of using the different model inputs and outputs, because I think we've often been a little bit too focused on sort of this model output goes directly into the next model, and we just sort of do a mechanical inputting. And I wonder, and I think there's definitely exercises where that's completely appropriate. But I think it would also be good if we start thinking about, well, maybe we need to have an intermediate step where we take in the inputs from different models then to create scenarios where those are just inputs into sort of a kind of a more of a scenario development exercise that then we insert into, whether it's our global models or whether our outputs go into sort of more of a narrative development that then feeds into national and or subnational, but not necessarily that it's just the raw outputs from the models that get shoved into the next one. Because I think sometimes when we do it that way, we end up getting somewhat limited in terms of what we can actually represent because we're stuck with whatever the numbers that we're giving or are receiving.
I mean, one of the follow-ups of the EAT Lancet 2.0 work is the regional deep dives. I don't know how far we will get with this, but it's probably a good starting point to what you mentioned. To go a little bit more into other dimensions of the scenarios, that's really a dietary change, probably a little bit more like Toon scenarios, 3 and 4, and focus on technology diffusion. I mean, we do inherently do the deep dive ourselves because we have the global model, we have the European regional model, we have the fund models, so we do it for ourselves. But the idea is now to do this also with Latin America, with Asia, with the different big regions in the world. So it could be maybe a good starting point.
Good. I think we'll stop there. It's right. We're right on time. It's 1 p.m. Thank you for those who have been online. I noticed Cloudy and Seawater is still there, so thank you very much for being part of this and for your inputs. And thank you all for participating. And we'll have the reporter condense all of it to one slide. Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Sounds good. Well, like with sports, our main three of sports the main just sometimes there's slides of course the biggest of course.
Some final summers.
How are you feeling?
And then part of the slides are going to give us a lecture, professor. Find this call in English as well. But the call, those are put up to and starting March 2026. So it is going to be perfect. We're going to have like almost a year with events
right now. Having people to do something this summer. It'll be difficult.
We can schedule
last question.
And then we could
Travel from
well, you can super
Somebody's in Australia.
Yeah. Perfect. We'll do that. Okay, what's your email? So I get it right?
Oh yeah, that's it.
House.
That's great.
I know it gets house.
Let's say
asking for
the
But for now.
Nathaniel Stringer. I go by Nat. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, that's nice to. Oh, it's great. No, I mean, and that's one reason I came, just to kind of plug in and see what you guys have been working on. 'Cause I haven't been involved, so.
Yeah.
Oh, good. Okay.
That's it from you?
That's just, well, I have to promise Roberto too, because, you know, we're doing county scale modeling, and that's the problem. It's like, we're trying to do this kind of meso scale stuff that doesn't really connect anywhere else, so.
Who are you working with in Minnesota?
Coming here,